The champagne flute shattered before I even realized my father's hands were around my throat. The music stopped mid-beat, a violin string crying out as if it too had felt the shock. Guests froze, forks suspended, glasses, trembling jaws falling open. My mother's shrill voice tore through the silence. "Isabel, stop embarrassing us." Blood slid down from the corner of my lip where my father's wedding ring had split the skin. I reached up, wiped it away with the back of my hand, and met his eyes across the glittering ballroom. "You can't choke independence out of me," I said softly. 15 minutes later, when Ethan Lau walked through those reception doors, the crowd went silent again. My mother screamed so loud the chandeliers seemed to shiver. But before that moment, before the applause turned to horror, there was the morning I thought I was just attending my sister's perfect wedding. The sun over Napa Valley was soft and golden that day, stretching over rows of vineyards and the white stone terrace of the Ritzfield estate. I arrived at 7, 3 hours before the ceremony, coffee still warm in my travel mug. The place looked like a painting: white roses, champagne ribbons, crystal chandeliers reflected in the morning dew. It should have felt peaceful, but something in my chest already knew peace didn't belong to this family. Lila, my little sister, had always wanted a fairy tale wedding. I'd helped make it happen, transferring $50,000 to Mom's account months ago to cover unexpected expenses. The string quartet, the imported roses from Florence, the crystal centerpieces, half of it existed because of me. But no one would mention that, not in this family. I was the ambitious one, the difficult one, the daughter who made everyone uncomfortable by being successful. "Isabel." My mother's voice cut through the morning like a blade. She stood near the archway, a clipboard in hand, already in full control mode. "That dress, couldn't you have chosen something more feminine? You look like you're heading to a board meeting." I glanced down at my navy silk dress, minimal and elegant. It was tailored, not loud. I had chosen it because it made me feel like myself. "Good morning to you too, Mom," I said lightly. She ignored the greeting. "Lila looks radiant, doesn't she? So graceful, so delicate. The way she said it, you'd think she'd raised a saint." I smiled, the kind that didn't reach my eyes. "She does look beautiful." "And you," she continued, "could learn something about humility from her." Then she turned away, already giving orders to the florists. My father, Charles Ward, appeared moments later. "Isabel," he said, adjusting his tie like the world owed him admiration. "Check the seating arrangements, but don't start reorganizing things like you always do." "Of course, Dad," I replied evenly. The seating chart was a disaster. Divorced couples sitting together, rival contractors side by side, but fixing it would only invite criticism. In this family, being right was the same as being insubordinate. Around me, relatives whispered. I caught pieces of their conversations. "Still single at 33, poor Elaine, no grandchildren yet." My cousin Tyler smirked at me from across the room. "Maybe if you left your office once in a while, Izzy, you'd have a +1. I smiled thinly. "Maybe if I worked less, you'd have someone to hire you." The laugh that followed was nervous. Tyler looked away first. "Small victories." Mom's voice floated through the air again, full of sugar and venom. "She's just very particular," she explained to a cluster of guests. "Always too picky for her own good." I pretended not to hear. I'd learned long ago that silence disarmed them more than confrontation ever could. In my head, I pictured my penthouse back in San Francisco, 45 stories above the city walls of glass opening to the skyline. My sanctuary, my reward for a decade of 80-hour weeks, red-eye flights, and closing deals worth millions. Every inch of that space represented freedom. No one had given it to me. I had built it one late night and one negotiation at a time. "Isabel," Aunt Donna called as I adjusted the flowers at the guest book table. "How's that little apartment of yours? Must be cozy up there in the city." "It's a penthouse," I said quietly. The group around her laughed. "Oh, Isabel, you and your exaggerations," she said between chuckles. "A penthouse? Maybe someday." Lila glided over then, all lace and sparkle, her face painted in practiced sweetness. "She likes to embellish," she said. "Last year, she told us she bought a Tesla." "I did," I replied. "It's parked outside." Their laughter faltered for a moment before recovering. Mom swooped in to smooth it over. Isabel's ambitious, she said, as if ambition were an illness. Too ambitious sometimes. There's nothing wrong with living within your means, Uncle Frank added. Not everyone can afford luxury. You're right, I said with a polite smile. There's no shame in living within your means. The irony was lost on them, of course. While they whispered about my imaginary success, my building's concierge had texted earlier to confirm tomorrow's delivery to my penthouse custom furniture for the study. I could have shown them photos, could have pulled up the Architectural Digest feature from last month, but that would have been feeding the beast. Validation meant nothing if it came from people who thrived on diminishing you. As the morning unfolded, Mom continued parading Lila around, introducing her to guests like a prized show horse. Our Lila, she gushed, so compassionate, so selfless. She volunteers at the Children's Hospital, you know. Not once did she mention me, not the award I'd won last year, not the millions in revenue I'd brought to my company, not the scholarship foundation I quietly funded for young women in business. None of it fit the image of the obedient daughter she wanted to show off. Dad clinked his glass near the head table, testing the microphone for his speech. We'll make the announcement right after the toast, he murmured to Mom. What announcement, she asked, pretending not to know. She'll have no choice, he whispered. Not in front of everyone. My stomach tightened. They were planning something. The way his eyes flicked toward me, and then away, told me everything I needed to know. It involved me. I stepped out onto the terrace for air. The vineyard stretched endlessly under the rising sunday. It should have been beautiful. It should have felt like home. Instead, it felt like the calm before a storm. In families like mine, love was currency, and they were always ready to spend mine for Lila's benefit. I took out my phone. A message blinked on the screen from Ethan Lau. See you Monday for the board review. Proud of what you've built. His timing made me smile. He didn't know how much I needed that reminder right then, that outside this suffocating orbit I was someone powerful, respected, untouchable. Inside laughter echoed again, the sound of a family convinced they could humiliate me into submission. I watched them through the glass doors, Mom gesturing dramatically, Dad basking in approval, Lila at the center of it all. For a moment I wondered what it might feel like to be her adored, without effort, protected from consequence. Then I remembered she was only adored because someone else was always paying the price. I adjusted the hem of my dress, squared my shoulders, and whispered to myself, family doesn't define worth. The words steadied me. I'd survived worse than gossip and judgment. I'd built something none of them could take unless I let them. As I turned back toward the ballroom, Dad raised his champagne glass, rehearsing his lines. His voice carried across the room. To family, he said with a smile. To the people who share everything. I froze for half a heartbeat. He said it was a toast. I didn't realize it would be a trap. The string quartet shifted from soft melodies to a triumphant march as the ceremony began under the gold-draped pergola. Rows of white chairs lined the vineyard, 200 guests fanning themselves beneath the warm Napa Sunday. I stood beside Lila, holding her bouquet as she whispered, "Don't lock your knees, you'll faint on camera." I smiled tightly. Even in a wedding gown, she found a way to direct the show. When the minister pronounced her, an Adam husband and wife applause rippled through the valley. My parents glowed in front-row perfection, proud, polished, invincible. I was the extra in their fairy tale. The reception shifted inside the grand ballroom. Waiters moved gracefully between tables with trays of champagne, and a jazz trio filled the air. Lila twirled across the dance floor as the photographer barked instructions. I stayed near the window, quietly content to fade into the background. For a few minutes it almost felt peaceful. Then the whispers began. A woman from my father's company approached with a glassy smile. "Your father said you've been so generous helping Lila start her life in the city. That's wonderful." She drifted off before I could ask what she meant. Two more guests offered similar congratulations on what exactly no one would say. Confusion turned to unease. Something was being orchestrated, and I wasn't invited to the rehearsal. When cocktail hour ended, my father clinked a spoon against his glass. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice booming through the microphone. "Before dinner, my wife and I have a few words." The crowd gathered around the head table. My mother's pearls gleamed beneath the chandeliers. She looked every inch the matriarch she wanted the world to see. I caught the faint glint in her eyes, the one I'd learned to recognize, before she struck, whether with words or expectations. "Family," my father began, "means everything to us. And today, as we celebrate Lila and Adam, we're reminded of how blessed we are by both our daughters." I blinked. Both, he rarely included me in speeches that way. I should have known better than to hope. "Our eldest Isabel," he continued, "has decided to make this day even more special. She's chosen to gift her San Francisco penthouse to her sister and new brother-in-law as they begin their life together." The ballroom erupted. Applause, cheers, gasps of admiration. I stood frozen. My pulse roared in my ears. My mother dabbed at fake tears. Lila pressed a manicured hand to her chest, feigning surprise. "Oh my God," she breathed into her microphone. "Izzy, are you serious?" The penthouse. Every face turned toward me. Cameras lifted. The photographer adjusted his lens. My father extended a hand, beckoning me forward. "Come up here, sweetheart," he said. "Let's show everyone what family unity looks like." I didn't move. The applause faltered. Whispers rose. I felt hundreds of eyes waiting for me to smile, nod, play along. But I stayed rooted where I was, glass still in hand. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice steady but clear enough to carry. "What did you just say?" My father's smile tightened. "Your penthouse, Isabel. The one overlooking the bay. You're giving it to your sister and her husband. It's such a beautiful gesture. That wasn't discussed with me." The crowd stirred. My mother's face blanched, then hardened. She snatched the microphone. "Don't be difficult, Isabel. It's family. It's my property," I said evenly. "And I haven't agreed to anything." The murmurs sharpened into a collective intake of breath. Someone near the back whispered, "Is she refusing?" Another said. At her sister's wedding, my father's jaw tightened. "Don't make a scene," he hissed. "This isn't about money." "Then why announce it in front of 200 people?" I asked. "You're being selfish," my mother snapped. "Your sister's starting her life. You live alone in a penthouse far too big for one person. Be generous for once." My voice stayed calm. "If generosity is the goal, you can buy her one." Gasps echoed through the ballroom. My father's face flushed red. "Don't talk to your mother that way." He turned toward the guests with a forced laugh. "She's joking, everyone. Nerves from a long week." "I'm not joking," I said quietly. The air thickened. Lila's eyes glistened with well-timed tears. "Izzy, please," she whispered into her microphone. "I just thought you wanted me to be happy. Your happiness doesn't depend on stealing what I've earned." A chair scraped. Someone muttered, "Unbelievable." My Uncle Frank shouted, "It's family, Isabel, don't ruin this day." My cousin added, "She's always been difficult." The voices layered, pressure mounting. My mother's voice cut through them all, sharp as glass. "Do you hear yourself? You're humiliating us." I met her gaze. "You did that when you made this announcement without my consent." The orchestra stopped playing. Even the servers froze mid-step. My father's composure cracked. "You'll hand over those keys," he said, each word clipped. "You will not embarrass this family." Something in his voice shifted low, dangerous. Before I could react, he stepped closer, eyes blazing. His hand shot out, gripping my throat. The world blurred. A glass shattered somewhere nearby. Someone screamed. I stumbled backward, my shoulder hitting the edge of a table. His fingers dug into my skin. I could smell the cologne he'd worn for decades, spice and power. My nails clawed at his wrist, pulling until his grip broke. When I caught my breath, the ballroom was dead silent. My mother stood motionless, horrified but still clinging to her pearls. Lila's mascara streaked down her cheeks, though no tears had truly fallen. The guests stared in stunned disbelief. The videographer's camera was still rolling, and across the room one of Adam's cousins held up his phone, live streaming. I wiped the blood from my lips, straightened my dress, and looked my father in the eye. You just made sure everyone knows exactly who you are. Someone called out for security. My father froze, chest heaving, realization dawning too late. I turned toward the crowd and said, "Excuse me." Then I picked up my clutch and walked toward the exit. No trembling, no tears, just silence. Behind me, chaos erupted, voices shouting, someone crying, others arguing. My mother's shrill tone cut through the noise. "Delete that video. Delete it now." But it was too late. The damage was done, immortalized in pixels and bandwidth. I reached the hallway, pulling out my phone with shaking fingers. The screen glowed with missed calls from Ethan Lau. One text blinked, "Saw the live stream, standing by for your word." My breath caught. Live stream. The thought made me dizzy. Thousands could be watching by now. I typed back one sentence, "Execute the contingency." Within seconds, the reply came. "Understood. I'll be there within the hour." I slipped the phone into my clutch and walked through the glass doors into the cool night air. My hands were trembling, not from fear but from fury. The vineyard lights shimmered in the distance, indifferent to the ruin behind me. I could still hear faint shouting from inside, but the sound didn't reach me anymore. For years, they'd called me the ungrateful daughter, the cold one, the disappointment. Tonight they'd made sure the entire world saw who truly deserved those titles. I pressed a hand to my sore neck and whispered to myself. They tried to choke me into silence. I took a long breath. They forgot I know how to speak through action. My heels clicked on the marble path as I walked to my car, the phone buzzing again. Another message from Ethan appeared on the screen. "Lawyers in motion. Press release ready. They won't see it coming." For the first time that night, I smiled. The ballroom behind me would still be chaos. Lila sobbing, my mother shouting at photographers, my father trying to salvage his image, but none of it mattered anymore. The moment he put his hands on me, he handed me the one thing he could never control: leverage. As I opened my car door, I caught my reflection in the window. Blood on my lip, bruises forming on my neck, eyes steady and clear. I wiped the smear away with a tissue and said softly, "Game on." The night smelled of grapes and revenge. I started the engine and drove toward the city lights, my phone lighting up once more with Ethan's name. I answered before the first ring finished. "Isabel," he said, voice low and calm. "I've seen enough. Are you ready to take back everything they tried to own?" I looked into the dark road ahead. "More than ready," I said. "Let's begin." The engine's hum was the only sound keeping me steady. My hands were trembling against the steering wheel as the headlights sliced through the dark vineyard roads. Behind me, the Ritzfield estate had erupted into chaos. My mother's voice still echoed faintly in my mind, shrill and desperate, demanding someone delete the video. As if the internet could ever forget. The bruise on my neck pulsed each time I swallowed. My lip tasted of blood and metal. I rolled down the window, letting the cold air sting my skin, washing away what little fear remained. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. "Ethan." I pressed the call button and held it to my ear. His voice came through, calm but edged with steel. "I saw the live stream." I swallowed hard. "You what? It's everywhere, Isabel. One of the guests streamed it from the wedding page. It's already been shared over 20,000 times. My chest tightened, part humiliation, part relief. The exposure I'd dreaded had arrived. But this time, it wasn't my shame being broadcast, it was theirs. "Execute the clause," I said. My voice sounded cold, detached, foreign even to me. "I was waiting for your word," Ethan replied. Clause 14.3. Protection against coercion of executive assets. "Are you sure?" "Yes," I whispered. "I'm done letting them choke my life for their reputation." "Then consider it activated," he said. "Get home. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Don't open the door for anyone else." The call ended. I drove faster. By the time I reached San Francisco, city lights glittered through the windshield like tiny promises. The skyline rose ahead, steady and silent, the one thing I'd built that had never turned against me. My sanctuary. My proof. When I pulled into the private garage, the adrenaline had burned down to something sharper clarity. Inside my penthouse, the air was still. I kicked off my heels, tossed my clutch on the marble counter, and walked straight to the window. Below, the city pulsed with midnight energy. I touched the bruise on my neck, wincing. The reflection staring back at me looked unrecognizable, a woman who had finally stopped apologizing for surviving. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Lau has arrived," my concierge said. "Send him up." Moments later, Ethan stepped into the penthouse, his expression unreadable. Two attorneys followed him, each carrying thick folders and briefcases. He stopped when he saw the marks on my neck. "Did you get checked by a doctor?" "I'm fine," I said. "He didn't break anything but my patience." Ethan's eyes darkened, but he didn't push. "Then let's get to work." He spread the documents across my glass dining table, the city lights reflecting off the pages. "Ward Developments is now under immediate corporate review. I control 38% of your father's shares through Sterling and Ward Capital. The clause you signed gives us full authority to intervene if there's evidence of coercion or abuse tied to an executive's property." Which we now have, one of the lawyers added, placing a tablet in front of me. On the screen was the viral video, my father's hand closing around my throat, my mother's shriek, my silent walk out. I forced myself to watch. Each second burned, but I didn't look away. "Proof," I said finally. "Use it." Ethan nodded to the lawyers. "Send the injunction notice. Freeze all public statements from Ward Developments. They'll hear from us in the morning." When they left, the penthouse fell quiet again. I poured 2 glasses of wine and handed him one. "Thank you," I said. He took the glass but didn't drink. "You don't need to thank me. I warned you years ago they'd come for what you built." "And I didn't want to believe it," I said softly. "I thought if I just kept giving, they'd stop seeing me as a threat." "They don't hate you because you have more," he said. "They hate you because you proved you never needed them." I exhaled, slowly setting the glass down. "What happens now?" Ethan leaned back against the counter. "Tomorrow I'll walk into that ballroom. Not as a guest, but as your business partner and their majority creditor. Publicly. Calmly. With lawyers present." I stared at him, stunned. "You're going there?" He nodded. "Someone has to remind your father what real power looks like and who actually holds it." Outside, the city stretched endless and silver. Inside, I felt something shift. The fear that had lived in my bones for years was gone, replaced by something clean and deliberate. My phone buzzed again. Messages flooded the screen, colleagues, acquaintances, journalists. Words like unbelievable, assault, and brave flashed in my notifications. The video had spread far beyond the wedding page now. Local news outlets were replaying it on loop. Headlines framed it as "Corporate Patriarch Attacks Daughter Over Property." "He's finished," Ethan said, reading my expression. "No," I replied quietly. "He's just about to learn." I walked over to the window, phone in hand, scrolling through the chaos online. I wasn't proud of the spectacle, but I couldn't deny the sense of poetic justice. My father had built his empire on reputation. Now reputation was burning it down. Ethan joined me at the window. "Are you ready for what comes next?" "I've been ready for 33 years, I said. I just didn't realize it until tonight. The next morning, the world woke up to scandal. My father's face was on every financial news network. Ward Development's PR team issued a weak statement about a family misunderstanding. It didn't help. 3 of his largest clients withdrew contracts before noon. His company's stock fell by 12%. Meanwhile, Sterling and Ward Capital released its own announcement, crafted by Ethan overnight. It read, "Our firm stands firmly against any form of coercion, abuse, or misconduct that compromises professional integrity. Miss Isabel Ward remains a valued executive and partner." Every outlet quoted it. For once, my name carried strength instead of scandal. That afternoon, Ethan texted, heading to the estate. "Press is already there." He didn't respond. I just watched the live feed on my tablet as cameras gathered outside the Ritzfield gates. The same entrance that had welcomed luxury cars and laughter now swarmed with reporters shouting questions. Inside, I imagined the tension, my father pacing, my mother clutching pearls, Lila sobbing. When Ethan entered, the cameras caught it all. He moved like someone used to owning the room. Behind him, 2 lawyers followed, briefcases gleaming in the morning light. I turned up the volume. "Mr. Ward," Ethan's voice came through clear on the broadcast. "As of this morning, you're under review for breach of fiduciary conduct under Clause 14.3. Public coercion of an executive, especially one under our partnership, triggers immediate suspension of your management rights." My father's voice broke through, indignant. "This is family business. The moment you made it public, you made it my business," Ethan replied. "And the internet has already declared its verdict." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed. My mother tried to intervene, shouting something about lies, but Ethan didn't even look at her. He turned to the reporters. "Sterling and Ward Capital doesn't silence its women. We protect them." Watching from my living room, I felt the weight of every word. Years of silence, dismissed achievements, backhanded compliments, all of it collapsing in real time under the truth. The broadcast ended abruptly when security escorted the press out. My tablet screen went dark. I sat there for a long moment, unable to move, the echo of Ethan's words still in my ears. When my phone buzzed again, it was a message from him. "Your father's face turned white when I mentioned the video. Your mother screamed. It's done." I walked to the balcony, wine glass in hand, the wind tugging at my hair. The city stretched infinite before me, alive, unbothered, full of light. "They wanted to own everything I built," I said softly to no one. "Now everything they built belongs to me." The phone buzzed once more. "Ethan, again, you should get some rest. Tomorrow we talk strategy." I smiled faintly. For the first time, the word strategy didn't sound like defense, it sounded like freedom. As the sun set over the bay, the bruise on my neck no longer ached. It had become a badge, proof that surviving wasn't weakness, it was warning. I raised my glass to the skyline. "To peace," I said quietly, "and to war when necessary." The city lights blinked back like an answer. The morning sunlight filtered through the glass walls of my penthouse, painting the marble floor in shades of gold. My phone hadn't stopped buzzing since dawn. Headlines flashed on every screen: "Business tycoon attacks daughter at wedding." The footage looped endlessly, the choke, the chaos, my calm exit. I turned the sound off, sipping black coffee as if the world wasn't on fire. By 8, Ethan texted, "Press conference at 10. They're trying to spin it. I'll handle it." I watched the city wake beneath me, calm as ever. There was a strange serenity in knowing I had nothing left to hide. The bruise on my neck was fading, but the memory was fresh, every second burned into my bones. I whispered to my reflection, "Peace through exposure. They can't bury what's already gone viral." At 9, my assistant forwarded an alert from Bloomberg. "Ward Developments faces corporate scrutiny after family scandal." My father's empire, built on reputation and fear, was crumbling under its own arrogance. I put on a charcoal gray suit, pulled my hair into a low twist, and looked at myself one last time. I didn't look like a victim. I looked like a verdict. At 10 sharp, Ethan messaged again. "They've set up at the Ritzfield Ballroom. Press cameras, PR firm. They think they can control the story." I typed back, "Then show them who really controls it." The ballroom that had once hosted the wedding now looked like a funeral for dignity. Reporters lined the back wall, flashes popping as PR assistants arranged microphones. The massive floral arch was gone, replaced with a backdrop that read "Ward Developments Family. Legacy. Integrity." The irony was almost poetic. My mother sat rigidly beside my father at the front table, pearls around her throat like armor. Lila, still in honeymoon white, dabbed fake tears with a tissue. My father's jaw was clenched tight, a mask of control over a collapsing empire. Elaine Ward, my mother, spoke first. "Thank you all for coming," she began, with brittle poise. "There's been a gross misunderstanding. We are a close family, and emotions ran high during a joyful celebration. Nothing more, reporters murmured, pens scratching. My father added quickly, the media has exaggerated what was a minor family disagreement. We request privacy as we move forward. A voice from the crowd asked Mr. Ward, is it true you assaulted your daughter in front of 200 guests? My father's nostrils flared. Absolutely not. That video was taken out of context. Lila piped up, trembling just enough to seem fragile. My sister has always been under a lot of pressure. She misinterprets our father's intentions sometimes. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. My mother forced a tight smile. We are united as a family. That's what matters. The ballroom doors opened. Heels clicked against marble. The sound carried like a countdown. Ethan Lau walked in, flanked by two lawyers in dark suits. His presence shifted the air immediately. Conversations died mid-sentence. Cameras turned. Even the PR team froze. My mother's smile faltered. My father stood halfway from his chair. Mr. Lau, he said stiffly, this is a private family matter. Ethan's calm voice filled the room. Then you shouldn't have live-streamed it to 50,000 viewers. Laughter and murmurs erupted. My mother's face went white. Ethan continued forward, unhurried, controlled. Apologies for the interruption, he said to the reporters. But since this family also happens to own 38% of my company, I believe I'm entitled to a few words. He took the microphone from the podium, his tone professional but cutting. For those unfamiliar, I'm Ethan Lau, CEO of Sterling & Ward Capital. And yes, I am the silent partner who controls the minority stake of Ward Developments. Cameras flashed wildly. My father tried to laugh it off. Ethan, please. There's no need for dramatics. Ethan turned to face him fully. You're right, Charles. There's only need for accountability. He motioned to one of the lawyers who placed documents on the table before the reporters. Clause 14.3 of our shareholder agreement states that any partner engaging in public coercion or moral misconduct, endangering the firm's integrity, may be subject to immediate review and temporary suspension. Last night's live footage meets every definition of that clause. My father's voice cracked. You can't do this. You're overstepping. I'm enforcing what you signed. Ethan interrupted, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. Attempting to seize an executive's assets under duress, followed by physical assault on record, qualifies as corporate misconduct. As of this morning, your authority within Ward Developments is frozen pending investigation. Gasps filled the room. The color drained from my father's face. My mother grabbed the microphone, voice trembling but still venomous. This is outrageous. You can't hijack a family gathering. Ethan turned to her. Mrs. Ward, your husband turned it into a business crisis when he tried to confiscate an executive property owned by Sterling & Ward Capital. You made it public when you called her selfish on a live stream. Don't confuse exposure with injustice. A reporter shouted, Is this true, Mrs. Ward? Did you pressure your daughter to give away her penthouse? Elaine's voice cracked. That's none of your. Ethan cut her off smoothly. It is now. Because the penthouse is protected under corporate asset law, and Miss Ward is not just your daughter. She's the vice president of global strategy at Sterling & Ward Capital. The woman you humiliated on camera leads the very division that expanded our firm across 3 continents. The room erupted into chaos. Questions, flashes, gasps. My father slumped into his chair. My mother's pearls looked tighter around her neck. Ethan's voice rose above the noise. Let me make something clear. Sterling & Ward Capital does not silence women. We don't let family names erase achievement. We don't tolerate abuse disguised as discipline. He turned toward the cameras. You all saw the video. Draw your own conclusions. Then he handed the microphone to the lead attorney, who summarized the corporate motion. Effective immediately, Mr. Charles Ward's voting rights are suspended. Control of all major financial decisions now lies with Sterling & Ward Capital until further review. Lila burst into tears. You can't do this. This is our family's legacy, Ethan's expression softened briefly. Then perhaps you should have protected it instead of watching it fall apart. The press roared again. My mother shouted for security, but none came. The cameras stayed rolling. Every humiliation they'd once inflicted on me now mirrored back at them under lights, under scrutiny, under truth. When it was over, Ethan gathered his papers, adjusted his cufflinks, and said calmly, "Thank you for your time. That will be all." He turned and walked out, leaving silence in his wake. Back in my penthouse, I watched the entire thing unfold live on 3 different news channels. Every word, every flash, every face caught in the avalanche they'd started. The video clips spread like wildfire across every social platform within hours. CEO confronts abusive business partner in viral showdown. Ward family empire collapses under corporate review. My phone rang. "Ethan." "You saw it, yes," I said. "Then you know," he replied. "It's over." I stared out at the skyline, 1,000 city lights blinking like small affirmations. "No," I said slowly. "It's just beginning." Outside, the city kept moving unconcerned with the wreckage of one family's downfall. Inside, I felt light for the first time in years. They had turned a wedding into a stage, a daughter into a spectacle, and a family into an empire of lies. But today, that empire had cracked in daylight. I touched the fading bruise on my neck, tracing the outline of where his hand once tried to silence me. It didn't hurt anymore. It was proof. On the screen, reporters replayed Ethan's closing line over and over again. "We don't silence our women, we promote them." I whispered the words to myself, tasting their power. The storm was over, and I had survived it, standing tall in heels with my voice intact and my enemies undone by their own arrogance. For the first time, I didn't feel invisible. I felt inevitable. By the time the sun set that evening, my name was everywhere. News anchors dissected the video frame by frame, commentators debated morality versus ambition, and social media had already crowned me the woman who brought down her father's empire. I didn't post, didn't respond, didn't scroll. I just watched the city lights flicker across my windows, steady and silent, as if the world outside was holding its breath. At midnight, I received a text from my assistant. "CNN wants a statement. Bloomberg, too." I ignored both. I didn't owe the public an explanation for surviving. The bruise on my neck had faded to a faint shadow, but the ache it left behind was somewhere deeper, an old pain now burned clean by exposure. By morning, the fallout had begun. 3 of Ward Development's major investors pulled out before breakfast, another 2 by noon. I didn't need insider reports, the headlines were enough. Ward Developments faces corporate collapse after family scandal. Ethan sent me a screenshot of the stock ticker, down 21% in a single day. His message read simply, "Justice looks good on you." The phone call started soon after. First my father's lawyer, then my mother, then Lila. I let them all ring until my voicemail filled up. My mother's message was venom wrapped in desperation. "You've destroyed us. Are you happy now?" My father's tone was softer, almost broken. "We need to talk, Isabel. Please." Lila's was the one that stung the most. "You've ruined everything. They're blaming me. You were supposed to protect this family, not tear it apart." Protect them. That was rich. I'd spent 3 decades doing exactly that. Paying their debts, cleaning their reputations, funding the very wedding that turned into my public crucifixion. I deleted every message without listening twice. By noon, Ethan called. "You've seen the news," he said. "Hard to miss," I replied. "Your father's board is in chaos. He's refusing to resign, but the directors are threatening to vote him out. It's only a matter of time." "Let them," I said. "He built his empire on fear. It's only fitting he loses it to silence." Ethan hesitated. "Are you okay?" I stared out the window at the skyline, the same one that had once mocked me with its distance. "I'm better than okay. I'm free." That night, I sat on my balcony with a glass of red wine, watching the lights blur into stars. For years, I'd imagined revenge would feel fiery, triumphant, a scream of victory. But it didn't. It felt calm, like a door closing after years of noise. I realized then that peace doesn't roar, it whispers. When I woke the next morning, my inbox was full of interview requests. Every headline spun my story into something larger than life. CEO's daughter takes a stand. Corporate feminism meets family karma. It was surreal seeing strangers debate my motives, my morality, my worth. Ethan advised me not to respond. Silence has more power right now than words ever will, he said. By the third day, the implosion was complete. Ward Development's largest partner, one of the Pacific construction giants, publicly terminated their contract. Clients followed. My father's company was no longer an empire. It was a sinking ship. And I didn't lift a finger. Instead, I donated my quarterly bonus to a women's legal fund that supported victims of family coercion. I made the transfer quietly, anonymously. It wasn't charity, it was symmetry. 3 days later, my father called again. This time I answered. His voice cracked before he even said my name. Izzy, I went too far. I shouldn't have. He stopped swallowing hard. I didn't mean to hurt you. Please don't destroy the company. It's all we have left. I closed my eyes. You mean it's all you have left? It's our family's legacy, he said. No, I corrected him softly. It's your legacy. Mine starts somewhere else. He didn't speak for a long time. I could hear him breathing, slow and heavy. Finally, he whispered, You sound just like your mother. That was the last thing he ever said to me. Later that evening, I found myself crying not out of grief, but exhaustion. The kind of tired that seeps into the bones after years of pretending to be fine. I let the tears come quiet and unforced until they ran dry. Then I took a deep breath, opened my laptop, and began drafting plans for something new. The idea had been forming for weeks, ever since the world had turned its attention to me. A foundation. A place for women like me, ambitious, independent, silenced by family expectations, to reclaim their voices. I called it the Boundary Project. Ethan loved the name. Simple, he said. Powerful, like you. The next morning, news broke that my father had officially resigned from Ward Developments. The statement, obviously written by lawyers, was cold and vague. After a period of reflection, I've decided to step down to focus on my family and personal well-being. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so pathetic. Ethan called again that afternoon. The board voted unanimously to remove him as chairman, he said. They're naming an interim CEO. Investors are asking for reassurance from Sterling and Ward. What do you want me to say? I asked. Say nothing, he said. You've already said everything you needed to. For the first time in years, I felt a weight lift from my chest. Silence, once my punishment, had become my armor. A week later, I attended a private board meeting in our San Francisco headquarters. Ethan handed me an envelope across the table. Inside was a single-page promotion recommendation. Senior Vice President, Global Operations. I blinked at him. Is this real? The board was unanimous, he said. After what you've handled in the past month, they'd be foolish not to promote you. I laughed, softly shaking my head. I got assaulted at a wedding, and that impressed them. You stood your ground under public scrutiny, he replied. You stayed composed when most people would have burned everything down. That's leadership. The promotion came with stock options, an office expansion, and a raise large enough to buy another penthouse if I wanted. I didn't. The one I had was enough, a symbol, a sanctuary. Instead, I donated part of the bonus to fund the Boundary Project's first outreach center. 2 days later, my father's public apology appeared online. It was short, clinical, and clearly crafted by a PR team. I apologized to my daughter Isabel for my inappropriate behavior. I acknowledge her professional achievements and her right to her own property. This matter is closed. My mother predictably refused to follow suit. Instead, she took to Facebook accusing me of being corrupted by corporate greed. Her post was shared thousands of times, mostly with comments like, "There's the problem right there." I didn't respond. The internet did it for me. Lila texted once more a week later. You got what you wanted. The wedding's ruined. My marriage is falling apart. Are you happy? I typed back. I didn't get what I wanted. I got what I earned. Then, I blocked her number. By the time spring arrived, the Ward name had become a cautionary tale in the business world. My father's firm was stripped to a fraction of its former size, and he'd quietly moved out of the city. My mother, still nursing her resentment, faded into social exile. Meanwhile, the Boundary Project was growing. Ethan and I met every week, mapping strategies, expanding outreach. What began as an idea had become a lifeline for dozens of women who'd lived versions of my story in silence. For the first time, I felt pride that wasn't tainted by guilt. One night, as I stood on my balcony again, the skyline shimmering beneath me, I realized what true revenge looked like. It wasn't headlines or humiliation. It was peace earned, protected, unshakable. I whispered to the night, "You can lose everything and still win if you keep your soul." And for the first time, I believed it. The mornings had become quieter. The chaos that once filled my life had dissolved into something slower, calmer, almost foreign. The sun climbed through the tall windows of my penthouse, catching the dust in midair, turning it to gold. I made coffee, opened the balcony doors, and listened to the city waking below. It was the same skyline I had looked at 1,000 times before, but for the first time it didn't feel like an escape. It felt like home. The bruises had faded completely, leaving only a pale shadow at the base of my throat. I traced it sometimes out of habit, a ghost of where my father's hand had once been. It didn't hurt anymore. It was just proof that healing didn't always need to erase the past. 2 weeks had passed since Ward developments collapsed, and my life had moved forward faster than I could process. At work, I was busier than ever. Sterling and Ward Capital was expanding into 3 new markets, and my name appeared in every industry report as one of the most powerful women in finance. Ethan congratulated me but warned visibility is a double-edged sword. Make sure you stay the one holding the handle. The board promoted me again to Senior Vice President of Global Strategy. The office they gave me overlooked the bay, larger than I'd ever imagined needing. My assistant decorated the walls with photographs from my travels: Tokyo, Singapore, London. The images made me realize how much of my life had been spent building for everyone else. For the first time, the empire I was building belonged entirely to me, but success didn't silence the echoes. At night, when the city dimmed and the emails stopped, I would still hear the faint sound of applause from that wedding hall, followed by my mother's voice slicing through it. "You're humiliating us. Sometimes peace can be too quiet." 3 weeks after the scandal, my mother broke her silence publicly. She appeared on a talk show, elegant as ever, clutching a tissue she never used. "It's all been blown out of proportion," she said, her tone perfectly measured. "Isabel has always been ambitious. Sometimes ambition blinds compassion. We're praying she finds her way back to family." I laughed when I saw it. Ethan didn't. "Don't underestimate her," he said. "Guilt is her favorite weapon." He was right. Within hours, social media picked it apart. The internet didn't buy her performance this time. Comments poured in, manipulation disguised as motherhood. Classic narcissistic parent behavior. "The daughter doesn't owe you redemption." For once, I didn't have to defend myself. The truth had a life of its own. That night, I turned off every screen and sat on my balcony with a glass of wine. The city was shimmering below, but my thoughts wandered to Lila. I hadn't heard from her since our last text. She had become a ghost too, her perfect marriage cracked under the weight of her own denial. Part of me wanted to reach out. Another part remembered how quickly she'd chosen them over me. I whispered into the night, let her heal in her own way. A few days later, she called anyway. I stared at the screen for a long time before answering. "Adam left," she said without preamble. Her voice trembled. "His family doesn't want to see me. They think I'm like Mom." I didn't know what to say. Silence stretched. "You could at least say something," she snapped. "You're just standing there pretending you're better than all of us." I don't pretend anything, Lila, I said quietly. I just stopped lying. Her breath hitched. You've ruined everything. You think you're the hero in this story, but you broke this family apart. No, I said, keeping my voice calm. I ended the illusion that we were ever whole. She hung up. I stood there with the phone in my hand, the words echoing in the empty room. Ending the illusion, it sounded simple, but it had cost me almost everything. That weekend, I attended a charity gala for women in leadership. The Boundary Project had officially launched its first program, a mentorship initiative for women rebuilding their lives after leaving controlling families or workplaces. Watching them speak on stage, confident and unapologetic, was more fulfilling than any boardroom victory I'd ever had. When I was called to the podium, I hesitated for a heartbeat. The lights were bright, the audience silent. I took a breath and said, "We're not here to burn bridges. We're here to stop being walked across." The room erupted in applause. It wasn't the kind that fades. After a few seconds, it rolled like a wave, warm and full of recognition. I felt something shift inside me. For years, my family had taught me that being silent was grace, but grace could roar too. Later that night, back in the penthouse, exhaustion hit me harder than ever. I removed my earrings, my heels, my armor. The stillness was almost unbearable. I sank into the couch, the wine glass untouched beside me. For the first time in months, I cried. Not out of sadness, not even from relief, just release. Ethan showed up the next evening without warning, carrying takeout and 2 bottles of wine. "You look like you've been working since the 90 seconds, he said. "I might have been," I replied with a small smile. He handed me a glass. "How are you holding up?" "I'm functioning," I said. "That counts for something." He studied me for a moment. "You've handled this entire nightmare with grace. But even warriors need rest." I laughed softly. "Grace is just discipline that learned to smile." He tilted his head. "Have you forgiven them?" I looked out toward the window, the lights flickering below. Forgiveness isn't required for closure. We ate quietly after that. The silence between us wasn't awkward, it was honest. For once, I didn't feel the need to fill the air. Before he left, Ethan glanced at the papers scattered across my coffee table, sketches and plans for the Boundary Project's expansion. "You're going to change lives with this," he said. I shrugged. Maybe. Or maybe it'll just remind people that walking away is sometimes the bravest thing you can do. He smiled. "Either way, you're doing exactly what you were meant to." After he left, I stood by the window for a long time. The skyline glowed under a soft haze, each light, a quiet affirmation that life kept moving no matter who tried to stop it. A week later, I met with the first group of women joining the Boundary Project's mentorship circle. We sat in a semicircle in a bright open office, each woman sharing her story. Different names, different lives, but the same ache, the same slow reclaiming of self. When it was my turn, I said, "You don't have to set yourself on fire to keep others warm. That's not love, that's servitude." A woman in her 50s nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "Hearing you say that out loud makes it real," she said. That moment made every scar, every humiliation worth it. That night, as I walked home through the cool evening air, the city seemed softer. The noise didn't overwhelm me anymore. It was music now, steady and alive. When I reached my penthouse, I poured one last glass of wine and stepped out onto the balcony. Below me, the city pulsed with light and motion. I felt neither above it nor apart from it, just connected. The wind brushed my hair across my face, and I closed my eyes. "I'm free," I whispered. Not in anger, not in defiance, just in truth. Peace had finally arrived, not as a thunderclap, but as a heartbeat I could finally hear again. It had been 3 months since the wedding that turned my world inside out, and life had settled into something resembling normalcy. My mornings began with silence and ended with purpose. The chaos was gone, replaced by a rhythm I didn't know I was capable of keeping. Every headline that once screamed my name had faded into the archives, replaced by newer scandals and fresher faces. But every so often, someone would recognize me on the street, their eyes soft with familiarity. Not pity recognition. At the office, people looked at me differently now, respectfully, cautiously. They'd seen the viral clip, read the interviews that followed, and decided I was both terrifying and inspiring in equal measure. Ethan found the balance amusing. You've become the storm and the calm. After it, he told me one afternoon, signing off on a new funding round for the Boundary Project. The project had taken off faster than I ever imagined. What started as a small initiative in San Francisco had become a movement. Women were flying in from across the country to attend workshops, networking sessions, mentorship events. We even had journalists covering its stories about the woman who turned family betrayal into empowerment. I didn't crave the attention, but I knew what it meant for the cause. If my name could open doors for others, then maybe it hadn't all been in vain. Meanwhile, Ward Developments was barely surviving. The board had dismantled most of my father's control, and the company's shares had been absorbed by creditors. The empire he'd worshipped now existed in fragments, his name removed from the website, his office cleared out by interns who probably didn't even know who he was. My mother rarely appeared in public anymore, though I occasionally saw her name mentioned in gossip columns, always tied to words like disgraced or estranged. Lila's marriage to Adam had imploded quietly. No announcements, no press releases, just a slow, private unraveling. I heard about it from an acquaintance at a networking event. Her husband's family wanted nothing to do with the Wards. After what happened, the woman whispered. Apparently, he moved out. She's been teaching art classes to kids in Napa. The news didn't bring satisfaction, only a quiet, lingering sadness. Some people never learn where the line ends until they fall over it. One evening, as I was finishing paperwork in my office, my phone buzzed. The caller ID made my breath catch. My father. I hadn't heard from him in months. Against my better judgment, I answered. His voice was quieter than I remembered. Isabel, he said my name, breaking in the middle like he'd practiced it too many times. I won't take much of your time. What do you need, Dad? A sigh. I've been thinking about what happened. About everything. I know I can't undo it, but I wanted you to know. He paused, searching for words. I didn't realize how much of my anger was fear. You built something on your own, something I couldn't control. I thought if I kept you small, I could keep you safe. The silence that followed felt heavy but not suffocating. I said softly, "That's not safety, Dad. That's captivity." "I know." His voice cracked. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to hear me say it. I'm sorry." For years I had imagined this moment, his apology, his voice breaking his recognition of who I really was. But instead of triumph, I felt stillness. Maybe this was what real closure sounded like. No fireworks, no victory speeches, just quiet honesty. "Thank you for saying that," I said finally. "I don't hate you. I just can't keep carrying what you gave me." "I understand," he whispered. "I hope you keep building." The line went dead. That night I couldn't sleep. His words replayed over and over in my mind until the edges of anger finally dulled. I found myself remembering him not as the man who'd hurt me, but as the man who'd once taught me to ride a bike, running behind me as I screamed with laughter. People aren't only the worst things they've done, but sometimes that's all they leave behind. The next morning, I drove to the Boundary Project's new office. We'd just opened our Los Angeles branch, and the building buzzed with new energy, young women in blazers and sneakers, their laughter spilling down the hallway. Seeing them reminded me that the cycle could end. It already was. We launched a mentorship program that week, pairing executives with women rebuilding their lives after leaving toxic families or workplaces. During one session, a woman named Nora stood up to share her story. She was in her 50s, soft-spoken but steady. "I spent my whole life apologizing for existing too loudly," she said. "Then one day I realized silence wasn't peace. It was surrender." The room erupted in applause. I smiled, my throat tightening. I knew that truth too well. That evening, Ethan joined me at the closing dinner for the launch. We sat on the rooftop of a hotel overlooking downtown LA, the city stretching out in golden threads below. "You've done something incredible, Isabel," he said. "We've done something," I corrected. He shook his head. "You would have done it with or without me." I smiled. "Maybe. But it's better this way." We fell into a comfortable silence, watching the city pulse with life. The wind carried the scent of jasmine and rain, and for the first time I didn't feel weighed down by memory. Ethan glanced at me. "Do you ever think about going back? Seeing them again?" "I saw Dad," I said quietly. He called. His eyebrows lifted. "How was that? Strangely human," I replied. He said he was sorry. "Do you believe him?" "Yes," I said. "But believing doesn't mean rebuilding. Some things are better left as lessons." Ethan nodded. "That's a rare kind of grace." "Grace doesn't mean weakness," I said. "It means I finally know when to stop fighting." When dinner ended, we walked along the promenade by the water. The night was cool, the sound of waves against the docks rhythmic and grounding. I thought about the women I'd met through the project, each one carrying invisible scars but still standing. We were all survivors of something: family, circumstance, expectation, and somehow we'd turned pain into architecture. When I returned home to San Francisco, I opened the drawer of my desk and pulled out the old letter my father had sent months ago, the one apologizing for his behavior after the wedding. I reread it slowly, then folded it once more and walked to the balcony. The city below was humming softly. I tore the letter into small pieces and let them drift into the wind, each fragment catching the light before disappearing into the dark. "This isn't revenge," I whispered to the night. "It's release." I felt lighter than I had in years. The next morning, the Boundary Project received a donation from an anonymous donor enough to fund another year of operations. I didn't need to ask who sent it. Some debts don't need words. As I stood before the mirror ready for another day, I barely recognized the woman staring back. The fear was gone, replaced by quiet strength. My reflection didn't look like a survivor anymore. It looked like someone reborn. "Peace didn't roar," it whispered, and this time I was listening. A year after the wedding, the city finally felt like mine again. The days no longer blurred together with headlines or lawyers or the sound of my mother's voice echoing through my head. Everything had slowed down to a steady rhythm, a quiet life built from the ashes of chaos. I woke early each morning, opened the balcony doors, and watched the light spill over the skyline. It wasn't triumph I felt anymore. It was peace. My penthouse looked different now. The sharp edges had softened. The cold walls, once filled with silence, now held life, plants, photographs, warmth. My assistant had insisted on hanging framed pictures from the Boundary Project's first anniversary: women, smiling arms linked, laughter frozen midair. Sometimes I stood in front of them and thought I turned humiliation into something holy. The Boundary Project had grown beyond anything I imagined. What began as a small office in San Francisco had blossomed into branches in Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York. Our programs reached hundreds of women survivors of coercive families, controlling partners, manipulative workplaces. We weren't just helping them find their footing, we were teaching them to walk without apology. That morning, my calendar was filled with interviews, board calls, and a press meeting for our national expansion. It was exhausting, but meaningful. As my driver pulled up to the event hall downtown, he smiled and said, "You know, Miss Ward, I showed your video to my daughter. She said you made her believe she could say no." I smiled softly. "Tell her she already can." Inside the venue, the hum of conversation vibrated through the air. Camera crews adjusted lights, journalists whispered, and at the center of it all, a large banner hung behind the stage. The Boundary Project, 1 year of empowerment. When it was my turn to speak, I stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd of faces, donors, volunteers, women who had found new lives through our programs. I took a breath. A year ago, I began. I stood in a ballroom where the people who were supposed to love me tried to take what I had built. I refused. That refusal cost me a family, but it gave me freedom. What I learned is that peace doesn't come from approval, it comes from boundaries. And boundaries are not walls. They're doors that open to people who can meet you with respect. The applause was thunderous, but it wasn't pride that filled me. It was something gentler, humbler. The sound of belonging. After the speech, I spotted Ethan at the back of the room, standing quietly with a glass of sparkling water. He didn't like attention, but I could see the pride in his eyes. When the crowd thinned, he approached. "You still can't give a speech without shaking the room," he said. I smiled. "You're the one who built the stage," he tilted his head. "You've built more than a stage, Isabel. You built a world." We sat together in the green room afterward, sharing a moment of silence that said more than words ever could. The air between us was different now, softer, calmer. For months we'd been partners in purpose, but the friendship had deepened into something unspoken. A connection born not from need but understanding. When he left that night, he said, "You should rest. You've done enough for one lifetime today." I didn't rest. Instead, I poured myself a glass of wine and read through the letters women had sent us from across the country. One from a mother in Texas read, "My daughter saw your story and left an abusive home. She's studying law now. Thank you." I folded the letter and set it beside the others in a wooden box I kept in my living room, proof that the storm had been worth surviving. Weeks later, a small envelope arrived in the mail. No return address, just a single name on the corner, Lila. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. "You were right," the letter began. "Mom broke me the same way she broke you. I see it now. I'm trying to find myself again. I'm sorry I didn't stand by you when you needed me. I hope you find peace. I'm trying to find mine." I didn't cry. I smiled. Then I sat down and wrote back, "You don't owe me anything, Lila. We were both raised to think love meant sacrifice. It doesn't. It means freedom. Find yours. You don't need to prove it to anyone, not even me." When I sealed the envelope, I felt something close quietly inside me, like the final page of a long story. A month later, I found myself driving through Napa for the first time since the wedding. The vines had grown thicker, greener, and the air smelled of ripened fruit. The Ritzfield estate loomed in the distance, stripped of its former glamour. It had been sold to new owners, a family who'd turned it into a vineyard resort. I parked nearby and walked along the fence, the sound of bees humming in the still air. The oak tree near the terrace still stood. Beneath it, I'd once dropped a photo of my penthouse the day I decided I would never again let anyone take what I'd built. I knelt there now, brushing my hand over the soil. "You don't own this place anymore," I whispered. "And it doesn't own me." I took a small envelope from my bag containing a photograph of the Boundary Project team. I placed it gently under the same patch of earth. This is what I grew instead. The wind rose, suddenly carrying the scent of wine and grass. For a moment, it felt like the vineyard was breathing with me, exhaling everything we'd both endured. Later that night, I received a call from a documentary producer. "We're filming a series about redemption stories," she said. "We'd love to feature the Boundary Project and your journey." I hesitated. "Only if you tell it truthfully. No dramatics. No villains. Just the facts," she agreed. When the episode aired, I didn't expect much. But within days, the clip spread across platforms, not because of the scandal it revisited, but because of one quote that caught fire online. "I don't regret what happened. I regret that it had to happen that way." But sometimes, a storm clears the air. People began sharing it everywhere, under photos, in articles, even on murals in women's shelters. The irony wasn't lost on me. The words I once used to defend myself had become a kind of quiet anthem. One night, I sat in front of the fireplace, scrolling through messages from strangers, women thanking me for helping them stand up, men saying they finally understood the weight of silence. I didn't know any of them yet. Somehow they all knew me. I closed my laptop and looked around my living room, the same space that once felt too large, too empty. Now it held meaning. It was no longer a fortress. It was a home. The next morning, I spoke at a university seminar on leadership. A student raised her hand and asked, "What does success mean to you now?" I thought for a long moment before answering. "Success isn't how much you gain," I said. "It's how little of yourself you lose while getting there." The students nodded, some scribbling notes, others just listening quietly. When I stepped outside afterward, the sunlight hit my face warm and clean. I had spent so many years fighting for acknowledgement, for justice, for revenge. But in the end, peace had come softly like forgiveness whispered to the wind. As I walked toward my car, I glanced up at the wide, cloudless sky. The world felt open again, endless and possible. I smiled and whispered, "I'm finally free to live." 18 months had passed since the night everything unraveled and the world had moved on. My story had turned from scandal to symbol, from headline to hashtag to case study. The media no longer followed me everywhere, and my name no longer felt like a weapon. The silence that remained was something new, something precious. I had learned to live without looking over my shoulder. The Boundary Project had become my life's work. We'd opened offices in Seattle, Dallas, and Boston. Every city had its own heartbeat, its own stories of women rebuilding from nothing. My days were filled with meetings, flights, and late-night phone calls across time zones, but it didn't drain me anymore. The chaos had purpose now. Still, peace has its own kind of loneliness. Some nights when the city outside went quiet, I would catch myself wondering what my life might have been if none of it had happened, if the wedding had gone smoothly, if my family had stayed intact, if my father had never laid his hands on me. But that version of my life didn't exist. It had died the moment I chose myself over them. One morning, while reviewing quarterly reports in my office, Ethan appeared at the door holding 2 coffees and that familiar half-smile that meant something was wrong. "Brace yourself," he said, setting the cups down. The press found a new angle. I arched a brow. "What now?" He handed me a tablet. The headline read, "Did Isabel Ward build her empire on family tragedy?" The article was a thinly disguised attack speculating that my success came from exploiting sympathy. It questioned my motives, suggested the Boundary Project was profiting off pain. The comments were worse. I read in silence, feeling that old familiar burn crawl up my spine. "They always find a way to twist strength into scandal," I muttered. Ethan leaned against the desk. "Ignore it. The ones who matter know better." I looked out the window, the city bathed in light below. "Maybe," I said softly, "but sometimes it feels like peace is just a break between wars." He didn't argue. He knew better than anyone that surviving didn't mean you stopped fighting. A few days later, my phone rang in the middle of a meeting. The number was unfamiliar, but something about it made my heart stutter. I stepped out into the hall before answering. "Isabel Ward," a man's voice asked. "I'm calling from the office of Charles Ward, your father." For a moment I couldn't speak. "What about him?" he asked. "That you be notified. He's been diagnosed with heart disease. Early stage but serious." The world tilted slightly. "Why are you calling me?" "He's asked to see you," the lawyer said gently. "He's updating his will. He wanted you informed in person." I hung up before he could say more. That night I sat on my balcony watching the city glitter and pulse beneath me. I hadn't seen my father since his public apology, if it could be called that. I thought of him sitting in some quiet house, stripped of power, weighed down by the empire he lost. Part of me wanted to ignore the call. Another part whispered that maybe some wounds deserved to be looked at one last time. 3 days later, I drove north to Santa Rosa. His house was small, tucked behind an overgrown hedge, the kind of place a man bought when he stopped pretending to be someone else. When he opened the door, I almost didn't recognize him. He'd aged 20 years in 2. His hair was gray, his posture slightly bent. But his eyes, those sharp, commanding eyes, had softened. "Isabel," he said quietly. "You came." "I did," I replied. "You asked to see me." He stepped aside. "Come in." The living room smelled of coffee and rain. Old photographs lined the mantel, images of family vacations, birthdays, moments before the fracture. He gestured to the couch. I wanted to see you before it's too late to say the things I should have said years ago. I sat down, hands folded. Then say them. He exhaled slowly, staring at his hands. I was wrong. About everything. About how I treated you, what I expected from you. I thought being a father meant control, but it was fear. Fear that you'd stop needing me. The words hung in the air. He looked smaller than I, remembered not because of age, but because the arrogance was gone. I don't expect forgiveness, he continued. But I want you to know. I see you now. I see what you built, and I'm proud. I hadn't expected that last word. It hit harder than anger ever had. I swallowed the lump rising in my throat. You hurt me, Dad. You broke something that can't be fixed. I know, his voice cracked. But you made something better out of the pieces. That's what I couldn't do. We sat in silence, the kind that didn't ache anymore. When I stood to leave, he handed me a small box. Inside was a photo of me as a child on his shoulders, both of us laughing. Keep it, he said. It's who we were before I ruined it. I nodded, unable to speak. Goodbye, Dad. He smiled faintly. Not yet, but soon. The drive back to the city felt longer than usual. The road wound through vineyards glowing gold in the afternoon light. I rolled down the window and let the air rush in. For the first time in years, I didn't feel anger, just release. That evening, I called Ethan. He apologized, I said simply. And it didn't change anything, I said. But maybe it didn't have to. He was quiet for a moment. That's growth, Isabel. Maybe, I said. Or maybe it's just exhaustion. He laughed softly. You've earned your exhaustion. The following week, we hosted a new conference for the Boundary Project in New York. I stood on stage as women from every background shared their stories. One of them, a young woman named Kendra, said, "We inherited their mistakes, but we don't have to live by them." Her words landed deep. That had been the truth of my life all along. After the event, I took a long walk through Central Park. The leaves were beginning to turn the city glowing with early autumn light. I sat on a bench and watched families pass by, fathers holding their daughters' hands, mothers laughing. For the first time, I didn't envy them. I just hoped they never lost what they had. When I returned home that night, I placed the old photograph from my father's box on my desk, beside a framed picture of the Boundary Project's first team. Two versions of families side by side, one built by blood, the other by choice. The next morning, an envelope arrived. It was from my father's lawyer. Inside was a single page: "He has left you the vineyard in Napa. His final wish was that it becomes something good." I closed my eyes. I already knew what I'd do. A few months later, the vineyard reopened as Ward Sanctuary, a retreat for women seeking to heal, rebuild, and rest. The first group arrived on a cool spring morning. As I walked the grounds, I felt the past and the present settle together at last. That evening, I stood on the terrace overlooking the vines, a glass of wine in hand. The sunset painted the sky in fire and gold. I whispered to the wind, "You took my voice, Dad. But you also taught me how to use it." The wind moved softly through the vines, carrying the words into the distance. When I returned to the city, I placed the vineyard deed in my safe and wrote a note to myself on a yellow sticky pad. Peace is not the absence of pain, it's the refusal to let pain own you. I stuck it on the mirror. It's still there today. That night, Ethan texted me, "Dinner tomorrow. No meetings, no press, just life." I smiled, typing back, "Just life." For the first time in years, those two words didn't sound like a luxury. They sounded like a beginning. The morning light streamed across the bay like a slow-moving tide, soft and golden. I stood by the window barefoot, holding a mug of coffee that had already gone cold. Outside, San Francisco was waking up, horns chatter, the distant hum of the city I had once felt so disconnected from. But not today. Today I felt still. The kind of stillness that comes after years of running. It had been 2 years since the wedding, 2 years since the slap, the choke, the chaos that turned my family name into a cautionary tale. And somehow life had rebuilt itself around the wreckage. I had rebuilt myself. The bruises were long gone, but their lesson lingered. Pain doesn't vanish, it transforms. The Boundary Project was turning 2 that week, and preparations were underway for the anniversary gala. The event would be held at the Fairmont Ballroom, the same venue where my father's press conference had once imploded in front of flashing cameras. A full circle I hadn't asked for but couldn't resist taking. The night of the gala, the air buzzed with elegance and nerves. Crystal chandeliers cast diamonds of light over hundreds of guests, donors, activists, CEOs, and women who had once stood where I did on the edge of breaking. I watched them talk, laugh, and hold their heads high. My kind of women. Survivors. When the lights dimmed and I took the stage, the applause hit like a wave, loud, alive, almost overwhelming. I waited for it to fade before speaking. 2 years ago, someone tried to make me hand over my home in front of 200 people. When I said no, they called me selfish. But what I've learned is this: sometimes the word selfish is just how others describe your boundaries. Laughter rippled softly through the room. Then I continued. We were taught to believe that silence was grace, but grace can roar. And tonight every woman here proves that boundaries aren't barriers, they're declarations of worth. When I finished, the room stood in applause. Some women were crying, others smiling. It wasn't vanity that made me proud. It was knowing that my pain had found purpose, the kind of purpose that ripples outward. Ethan was waiting near the side of the stage when I stepped down, his tie undone, his smile quiet but warm. You did it again, he said. I laughed softly. You say that like it's surprising. It's not, he replied. It's just, you never stop knowing how to turn fire into light. We clinked glasses of champagne. He handed me one and said, To peace that doesn't need applause. To peace, I echoed. We stood in silence for a moment, watching the crowd mingle. My heart felt strangely full. But when Ethan turned to me and asked, Do you ever think about your mother? I wasn't ready for the question. I think about her more than I should, I said. Sometimes I wonder if she'll ever see what she did to me. He nodded. Would you want her to? I looked at the bubbles rising in my glass. No, I just want to stop caring. He smiled faintly. That's its own kind of forgiveness. I didn't answer, because that night I wasn't sure forgiveness was something I wanted. A week later, the past found me again. I had just finished an interview for a leadership documentary when I saw her, standing outside the studio entrance, older, thinner, wrapped in a beige coat that swallowed her frame, Elaine Ward. My mother. For a long moment, I couldn't move. She looked fragile, smaller than I remembered. Her voice trembled when she spoke. You look beautiful, Isabel. I swallowed hard. Mom, may I talk to you? Against my better judgment, I nodded. We walked to a nearby cafe, a quiet corner with dim lights and the low hum of conversation. She ordered tea. I didn't order anything. Her hands shook as she stirred sugar into her cup. I saw the gala, she said. You spoke well. You've always had a way with words. I said nothing. She continued, I've been in therapy. Your father's death. It made me realize what I did, what I let happen. I thought control was love. I was wrong. Her eyes glistened, but I didn't know if they were tears or remnants of performance. You wanted control, I said quietly. You wanted obedience. I wanted to keep us together, she said. I thought if I held on tight enough, nothing would break. Everything broke, I said. She nodded slowly. I know, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed to tell you that I see you now. I looked at her for a long moment. The woman sitting across from me wasn't the one who had humiliated me in front of the world. She wasn't even the mother I'd grown up with. She was just a woman who'd lost everything trying to control what she never understood. Thank you for saying that, I said. But forgiveness isn't something I owe. It's something I outgrew. Her lips quivered. I deserve that. When we left, she insisted on paying the bill. It was a small gesture but symbolic. For once, she gave something without expecting anything in return. Outside, the air was crisp, the streetlights glowing in the dusk. We stood there awkwardly. Then she said, "You remind me of who I wanted to be." I didn't know what to do with that, so I just nodded. "Take care of yourself, Mom." She smiled faintly, tears shining on her lashes. "You already are." When she walked away, I waited until she disappeared into the crowd before exhaling. Closure didn't come like thunder. It came like a door closing quietly. That night I went home and opened my safe. Inside, wrapped in a velvet pouch, was the original key to my penthouse, the same one they had tried to take from me 2 years ago. I turned it over in my palm, the metal cool and heavy, and realized I didn't need it anymore. I stepped onto the rooftop terrace, the city glowing below, and tossed the key into the night. It spun once, twice, before vanishing into the darkness. I whispered to no one in particular. This was never about the penthouse. It was about owning myself. The wind carried the words away. The next morning, I walked into the Boundary Project's headquarters. The office buzzed with energy, young women planning outreach events, volunteers setting up the new mentorship program. I paused near the entrance, watching them laugh, argue, build. One of the interns, a girl barely 20, spotted me. "You're Miss Ward, right?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You changed everything." I smiled gently. "No, you did. I just went first." Later that afternoon, I returned to my office. On my desk sat a bouquet of lilies and a handwritten note. Ethan's handwriting. "You don't owe the world anything anymore. Just live." I picked up the flowers, breathed in their faint sweetness, and looked out at the city. For the first time in years, there was no anger, left no grief, no unfinished business. Just life. As the sun began to set, I whispered, "I used to think peace was quiet, but it's not. It's steady. It's enough." And in that moment, for the first time, I finally believed it. The morning of the conference was overcast, the kind of gray sky that made the world feel like it was holding its breath. I stood before the mirror in my hotel room in Geneva, fastening the final button on my dark navy suit. The invitation from the United Nations Women's Council had arrived months earlier, an invitation to deliver the keynote address on reclaiming power through compassion. It was surreal knowing I was here not because of scandal, but because of the strength that came after it. Downstairs, the lobby hummed with quiet urgency, delegates, journalists, translators moving in purposeful rhythm. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing against my chest as I stepped into the car waiting outside. Ethan had already left for the venue earlier. To coordinate logistics, though, I suspected he wanted to give me space before I faced the world again, this time, on a global stage. When we arrived, banners with my name stretched across the entrance, Isabel Ward, a new definition of power. For a long time, that word had felt foreign to me. Power had been something my father wielded like a weapon. Now it was something softer, quieter, shared. Backstage, I stood behind the curtain, palms resting against my notes. The MC introduced me, and the applause was immediate. I stepped out, the light blinding for a moment, the sea of faces, leaders, activist, students blurring into one collective heartbeat. 2 years ago I was known as the woman who refused to hand over her penthouse, but what I truly refused to give away was myself. The room fell silent. I took a breath, grounding myself in the truth. I believed for too long that success meant compliance, that dignity was negotiable, that love had to be earned through sacrifice. But boundaries are not selfish, they are sacred. They are the promise we make to ourselves that we will never again shrink for someone else's comfort. I paused, scanning the crowd. Faces softened, nodding. We can't always choose our pain, but we can choose what we build from it. Compassion is not weakness, it's reclamation. It's saying, you can't have my voice, but I'll still use it to lift others. Applause swelled again, and when I looked to the side of the stage, I saw Ethan standing there, hands clasped, pride written across his face. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was speaking for survival. I was speaking for legacy. When the speech ended, the standing ovation lasted longer than I could bear. As I stepped off the stage, a woman from Kenya, one of the delegates, embraced me. "You spoke for all of us," she whispered. And maybe in a way I had. After the session, Ethan found me backstage with 2 coffees. "I think you just made history," he said. "I just told the truth," I replied. He smiled. "That's usually what makes history." Later that evening, we went out to dinner by Lake Geneva. The restaurant was small, candlelit, the air crisp, with the scent of rain on stone. We talked about everything and nothing: the foundation, his new expansion plans, the vineyard retreat we'd just opened in Napa. But eventually the conversation shifted the way it always did when silence carried something heavier. "You've done it, Isabel," he said quietly. "You've turned every scar into light." I shook my head. "No, Ethan, I just stopped hiding the scars. They glow on their own when you stop being ashamed of them." He looked at me for a long moment before saying, "You know the board back home wants to name an award after you." I laughed softly. "Awards fade. Impact doesn't." His expression softened. "You sound like someone ready to walk away from the boardroom." "Maybe I am," I said. "Maybe it's time to give everything I've learned to the people who need it most. The company doesn't need me anymore. The world outside does." He reached across the table, not touching, but close enough for the air to hum between us. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you." The next week, back in California, I received a letter from my father's lawyer. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. "Charles Ward passed peacefully last night. His estate includes a vineyard deed in your name. His final request: use it well." I sat in silence for a long time, the paper trembling in my fingers. The same land where he had once stood proud and cruel would now be mine to shape. Maybe that was how life evened itself out, not through vengeance, but through reclamation. Months later, the vineyard reopened under a new name, Ward Sanctuary. A place to begin again. The cottages were rebuilt, the gardens replanted, the old oak tree left standing at the center. It would be a retreat for women, starting over, therapists, counselors, and survivors, working side by side to turn pain into progress. The morning of the dedication ceremony was warm and bright. Rows of white chairs lined the vineyard lawn. Reporters stood at the back, but this time there were no microphones thrust in my face, no flashbulbs blinding me. Just sunlight and the sound of wind in the vines. I walked to the podium holding the same earring I had worn the day of the wedding, the one that had flown across the marble floor when my mother slapped me. It was tarnished now, but it reminded me of the moment everything changed. I held it up briefly before placing it in the soil at the base of the oak tree. "This place," I said, "was built from what once broke me. Let it now break open, healing for others." The crowd applauded quietly. There were tears in more than a few eyes. Ethan stood near the front, his expression unreadable, but full of something deep: admiration, pride, maybe love. After the ceremony, he joined me under the tree. The sunlight caught in his hair, and for a moment the years between us, years of war, rebuilding, and forgiveness, melted away. "You did it," he said. "We did it," I corrected. He smiled. "You always have to share the victory." "Always," I said. "Because no one survives alone." That evening, after everyone left, I walked through the vineyard paths. The air smelled of earth, and grapes, the colors rich and golden. I stopped halfway down the trail and looked back at the sign at the gate, Ward Sanctuary. The irony no longer hurt. It felt right. The name was no longer his. It was mine. The phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from Lila. I saw the photos. Dad would be proud. So am I. I typed back, "Thank you. You should come visit sometime." She replied with a heart emoji. Small, simple, but enough. When I returned to the house that night, the stars were visible even through the city haze. I poured a glass of wine from the first vineyard batch, light and sweet. Ethan joined me on the terrace, his jacket slung casually over his shoulder. "You're finally at peace," he said. I looked out at the hills, the glow of the vines stretching into the dark. "Peace didn't find me," I said. "I built it." He smiled, stepping closer. "Then maybe it's time to build something else too." I laughed, shaking my head. "One thing at a time." He didn't press. We stood there in silence, the night soft around us, the vineyard alive with quiet possibility. Somewhere between the sound of the crickets and the rustle of the leaves, I realized I wasn't surviving anymore. I was living, and for the first time that was enough. The vineyard was quiet at dawn, the air still heavy with the scent of lavender and rain. I walked barefoot through the grass, the morning dew, clinging to my skin like a secret the earth wasn't ready to let go. The world was soft in that hour, uncomplicated, honest. For years I'd lived waiting for storms, but lately I'd woken to sunlight and silence and called it peace. The vines stretched endlessly in every direction, green and gold in the early light. Ward's sanctuary had become more than a place, it was a heartbeat, a rhythm of women rebuilding themselves from pieces that once felt too sharp to touch. I watched a few of them through the distance, two women laughing, as they set up breakfast tables on the terrace, a counselor leading a small meditation circle beneath the oak tree. The sound of laughter rolled across the hills. That sound had become the anthem of my days. When I took over this land, it was haunted by power and pride. Now it hummed with forgiveness. Inside the main house, I found Ethan standing at the kitchen counter, sleeves rolled up, coffee already brewed. He smiled when he saw me. "You don't sleep anymore, do you?" "Not much," I said, pouring myself a cup. "I don't need to. My nightmares got tired of losing." He chuckled softly, leaning against the counter. "You've built something remarkable, Isabel." "I just planted what was left of me," I said. "Everything else grew on its own." Later that morning, we walked the west side of the vineyard where new vines were being planted for the next season. The soil was rich and dark, freshly turned. Ethan knelt beside one of the rows, running a hand through the dirt. "You used to build skyscrapers," he said. "Now you build roots." I smiled. Maybe this was what I was meant to build all along. He stood, brushing the dirt from his hands. "London's ready," he said. "The Boundary Project will open its first international branch next month. I was hoping you'd come to the launch." "I think it's time I let you handle it," I said. "You're good at carrying the torch." He looked at me for a long moment. "You're trusting me with your vision." "I'm sharing it," I replied. "That's what we built this for, to pass it on." That afternoon, a letter arrived with no return address. The handwriting was unmistakable, elegant, steady, familiar. My mother. I sat on the veranda as I opened it. The paper trembled in my hands. "I saw what you built. I was wrong to call it rebellion. You've turned pain into something I can finally understand. I'm proud of you. Love, Mom." I read it twice, then folded it carefully. For a long time, I just sat there staring at the vineyard, stretching beneath the sunday. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I simply breathed. Forgiveness didn't always need words. Sometimes it just meant not locking the door again. I placed the letter in a wooden box, along with two other keepsakes, a photo of my father at the vineyard, smiling in the rare way he used to, and a small note from Lila, written after she finally visited the sanctuary for the first time. "I get it now," she'd written. "We were never fighting for attention. We were fighting for air." That evening, we held our annual retreat, a gathering of women from every branch of the Boundary Project. The vineyard glowed under hundreds of string lights, long tables, draped in white cloth stretching between the rows. The air was alive with laughter, the clinking of glasses and the music of a violin floating from the patio. When it was time to speak, I stood beneath the oak tree, the one that had seen every version of me. I didn't use notes. I didn't need them. When I first started this project, I said I thought I was teaching women how to set boundaries. But what I've learned is that boundaries aren't barriers, they're beginnings. They're the lines that lead us home to ourselves. I looked at the faces before me, some familiar, some new. We came here as strangers carrying stories too heavy to say out loud. But we leave as women who know that silence can roar. You've all reminded me that healing isn't the end of pain, it's what grows in its place. Applause rose like a wave, warm and real. I caught Ethan's gaze near the back, his expression unreadable but full of quiet pride. When the night ended, I stayed behind. The crowd drifted back to the cottages, the laughter fading into the distance. I walked to the oak tree, its roots deep and wide, the branches alive with fairy lights that flickered against the dark sky. I knelt at its base and buried a small bronze plaque into the soil. Peace begins where fear ends. I brushed the dirt from my hands and whispered, "This time I built something they can't take away." As I stood, Ethan appeared beside me. He didn't speak at first, just handed me a glass of the vineyard's first wine. "It's good," he said. "Better than I expected." I smiled. "It's a survivor's blend." We stood side by side, the night breeze rustling through the vines. "You know," he said, glancing toward the lights of the sanctuary below, "someone should write your story." I turned to him. "They already have. Every woman here is a chapter," he laughed softly. "You'll always find a way to make a quote out of everything. That's what happens when you survive long enough to tell the story yourself." We stood in silence, watching the moon rise over the hills. I thought about my father, my mother, my sister. For the first time, their ghosts didn't follow me. They rested. Ethan looked at me again. "So, what's next for?" Isabel Ward the first exhaled, smiling at the horizon. "Nothing grand, just life. And for me, that's everything." He raised his glass. "To life, then. To peace," I said. We clinked glasses, and the sound was soft, final, beautiful. The next morning, I walked alone through the vineyard, the first rays of sunlight turning the dew into tiny stars. Every vine shimmered with new life. I paused by the oak tree, closed my eyes, and whispered a quiet prayer, not of gratitude, not of longing, but of release. Once I thought revenge would set me free, but freedom had come quietly in forgiveness, in boundaries and peace that didn't need witnesses. I walked to the vineyard gate, the earth warm beneath my feet, and looked back one last time. The sanctuary stretched across the hills like a dream fulfilled. I smiled, whispered to the wind, the story didn't end with pain. It began with peace. And maybe that's what all of this had been about, learning that sometimes the most powerful revenge is a life lived gently. If you've ever had to rebuild after betrayal, if you've ever chosen peace over approval, this story is yours too. Tell me what boundaries gave you freedom. I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. And if you believe, like I do, that healing is its own kind of revenge, stay with us. There are more stories waiting about courage, justice, and the quiet power of choosing yourself. Because sometimes the ending isn't the end at all. It's the beginning of peace.